Mars is an important part of video games. That's perhaps due to how it feels simultaneously out of reach and just in our backyard. A desolate wasteland, whose orange dirt and promise of water and life feel like a potential stepping stone for humans to reach into the stars. In Mass Effect, it's the scientific outpost the Protheans use to observe evolving humans before being wiped out by the Reapers. In Surviving Mars, it's a place to be colonized, utilizing crude resources to scrape together a way of life. And in Doom, its moons are the location of a demon invasion, a last stand before hell on Earth. But for the Red Faction series, Mars is its most valuable resource. Its versatility as it progresses through different stages of human colonization and occupation provides a unique backdrop for 3 very different types of games. But since the release of Red Faction Armageddon in 2011, the series has become what Mars actually is: quiet and dormant. What was once a unique part of the FPS and open world genre now seems to be all but forgotten. So what happened to Red Faction? What are the odds we'll see another title? And what's the deal with all that fancy destruction tech anyway? Parallax Software was a company split down the middle. After their success in developing The Descent 2, a re-release with some extra content and levels of their successful underground space combat title, co-founders Mike Koulas and Matt Toshlag divided up their workforce in Champaign, Illinois. Toshlag would found Outrage Entertainment in Ann Arbor, Michigan, while Koulas' team would stay in Champaign and rename Parallax to Volition. When Uproar's Descent 3 underperformed in 1999 and Volition was bought up by THQ, pre-production on Volition's Descent 4 was instead moved to develop something different, a first-person shooter named Red Faction, getting the player out of the cockpit and into the boots of a miner during a workers' uprising on Mars. During development, however, the game had a different name: Red Shift, a title reminiscent of Gearbox's Half-Life spin-off Blue Shift. That Half-Life connection isn't in name only. Red Faction most feels like a game that was developed and released immediately after Valve's seminal shooter. Parker, like Gordon Freeman, is less of an unstoppable superhero and more of an everyman who finds himself in the fight because he happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And its seamless level design feels similarly influenced, with its claustrophobic corridors and caverns that are just the right balance of feeling like actual places while still leading the players forward. But where Red Faction shines is in its Geomod technology, which allows for previously unseen destruction of the environment. While it's not nearly as unscripted or involved as later titles in the series, it provides the opportunity for levels that twist in on themselves, creating varying critical paths and an opportunity to outsmart or avoid enemies as necessary, furthering the feeling of being outmatched in the midst of a revolution. Volition's intention was to have everything destructible in the world, but due to technical constraints of the time, it's limited to specific areas and assets, but it's still technically impressive in a way that elevates the game to a sort of diet immersive sim. It's just enough to encourage multiple playthroughs of encounters to see if there's a right way to do things, but without overwhelming players with too many systems or overly complicated design. What's interesting about revisiting Red Faction so far after its release is just how much of what makes a great entry is here from the start. Over-the-top destruction, weapons based on actual mining tools, and facing off against a superior technological force are all here. And as Red Faction would drastically change, those core values were what the series continued to do best. While Volition was working on the title, they were unsure of its potential success. It was a departure from what they had done in the past, and the other title they had been developing at the same time, Summoner 2, a sequel to the PS2 launch title, was expected to be received better. However, due in part to the lack of PS2 first-person shooters, Red Faction was a success, and Volition's attention was turned to making a sequel. Red Faction 2 is an odd game. On the surface, it appears to be the title in the series that's closest to its immediate predecessor. It's still an FPS, and coming out only a year after the first Red Faction game points to a sequel that's probably iterative. However, Red Faction 2 couldn't be any more different. Like with Doom 2, the sequel moves away from Mars to Earth, but also gets rid of Parker and much of the plot from the first game, to create something entirely new. This time, much more focused on being a proper story, populated with actors like Jason Statham. Red Faction 2 isn't necessarily a Halo killer. Instead, it's something Halo adjacent, adopting the stylings and, for lack of a better term, simplifying and consoleizing the first game for the PS2. As a result, the game loses quick saves, adopting a new checkpoint system that's spaced out just a little too far, and a regenerative health system that forces the player to hide behind cover for just long enough to screech tension and enjoyment to a halt. While these do feel a result of being rushed, that's not to say that Red Faction 2 is a bad game, just a little unfocused and slightly simpler. It's really the first time we see Volition's kill your darlings approach to game design, boiling down and cutting unnecessary parts for a game that feels lean, if not a tiny bit simplistic. Geomod remains, but it's implemented in a more direct way, by giving your player character an explosive weapon out of the gate and introducing more characters with grenades and rocket launchers. While there are fewer opportunities to bypass the critical path, it's still used as a cosmetic change to a battlefield that makes for a better spectacle. It feels less like it was developed with Geomod directly in mind, but is still used often enough to feel unique. While the sequel was received about as well as the original Red Faction, the first-person shooter was becoming a fiercely competitive genre, and despite their competency, the series would go on a hiatus for 6 years. Volition, after seeing the success of Grand Theft Auto, would begin development on their game Saints Row, a title that laid into the absurdity of the open-world genre. It was a huge departure for Volition, and more importantly, a huge success. It feels a bit ironic that the studio that started out as the developer of claustrophobic action in The Descent now had a series whose greatest strength was in its freedom, pushing towards non-linear progression and going beyond the formula that Grand Theft Auto had almost perfected. During their work on a sequel to Saints Row, the team that had been working on Volition's Punisher title was gradually transitioned into developing a new Red Faction, one that was designed from the ground up to put the destruction at the forefront, and bringing Geomod to the next generation, taking what they had learned from not only Saints Row, but the previous titles to take Red Faction open world. And in 2009, Volition would release Red Faction Guerilla. Guerilla is almost unrecognizable from its predecessors. While it still maintains corporations like Altor and references to characters like Parker, it's still mostly a soft reboot. Gone are the tight corridors and inner tunnels of Mars, and instead we have the orange skies and crude lunar base style structures of a recently terraformed Martian surface. But perhaps most obviously missing is the first person perspective.
At the beginning of Red Faction Guerilla, we actually had it in first person, and what we found was that it wasn't any fun. The way our destruction system works means that everything could be completely destroyed, but you couldn't see what was happening. Just as an experiment, one weekend we just pulled the camera back and it was a night and day difference. You could see everything and it felt so much more satisfying.
While I don't necessarily doubt this, it's worth noting that Volition had gotten very good at developing third-person open worlds with Saints Row 2 in particular, and while they're very different games, it's clear that they had taken lessons from their other franchise and adapted it to make Guerilla the best game it could possibly be. It wouldn't be surprising to me if Guerilla started out in the third person. But regardless, the result is perhaps the best in the series, carving out a Grand Theft Auto clone only barely, instead more closely resembling the destruction focus of games like Just Cause and Pandemic's Mercenary series. For me personally, this was my first impression of Red Faction, and as a kid who loved Mercenaries in particular, this was a nice science fiction-y companion. But even to this day, Guerrilla's destruction feels unparalleled and provides enough emergent gameplay and fun moments to make it a game I frequently return to. By making Alec Mason, the recent Mars resident you play as, less resilient, Guerilla truly lives up to its name, forcing players to plan out attacks, improvise when things go wrong, and make a quick exit. In a lot of ways, this feels like a precursor to Far Cry's base invasions that have become so common, but here it feels like the developer's guiding hand is far less prevalent. Encounters with the EDF don't always go in the same way with alarms and caged animals. They're clearly unscripted chaos that the developers want you to approach in a unique way, with the very real possibility of dying in an unpredictable manner. It feels less like the player being guided along a path, and instead actually upsetting the status quo. That, coupled with what is clearly tech in a rudimentary form, and a distinct lack of polish on anything that isn't that destruction, makes for a clunky in a charming way sort of game. It's not something overburdened with systems that don't quite work, and as a result, it feels refreshingly unpretentious. Guerilla had shifted the series into something that was unrecognizable, but still managing to be a surprise hit of 2009. proving the series could adapt with shifting times to still remain competitive without being confined to a specific genre. While Guerrilla was in development around the same time, THQ put Locomotive Games of Destroy All Humans Big Willy Unleashed fame in charge of another Wii exclusive title, Red Faction B.E.A.S.T. While not a whole lot of information is available about it beyond a handful of leaked animations and renders, it does appear to be relatively similar to what Volition was doing. However, it would be cancelled around 7 months before the release of Guerrilla, when Locomotive would be closed down in November 2008. It's likely that THQ's attitude towards it was similar to Destroy All Humans' work with Big Willy, where the development for tentpole franchises had moved to the more powerful 360 and PS3, but they still wanted to tap into the Wii market with a smaller scale version of what the bigger titles were doing. This paints a picture of a THQ that has confidence in not only Guerrilla, but the future of the Red Faction series as a franchise that could sustain multiple titles on multiple platforms, and its potential staying power as a tentpole franchise for THQ alongside the likes of Destroy All Humans and Saints Row. And with that comes the importance of brand synergy. With the return of the franchise, the publisher would move to not only take the series to multiple platforms, but also make it multimedia. The Sci-Fi Channel's original movies are not necessarily known for their quality. In the mid-2000s, these $1 to $2 million schlock horror and sci-fi flicks were somewhere slightly above the works of Asylum and Uwe Boll, but not by much. Their goal wasn't to make Citizen Kane, it was to give the viewers something they couldn't get anywhere else. While these original movies weren't often licensed IP, Red Faction Origins was set to change that, intending to do double duty as a late-night flick for sci-fi fans, but also a TV movie pilot for a potential Red Faction TV show. Following Alec Mason's son Jake, Origins was set to bridge the gap between Guerrilla and its coming sequel Armageddon, which would launch in the same week. It's a film that Sci-Fi clearly had confidence in, populating with not only actors from its hit TV shows Stargate and Battlestar Galactica, but also Robert Patrick of Terminator 2 fame as Alec Mason. However, being an in-between to the dramatic differences in art direction between Armageddon and Guerrilla, we get a film that looks muddy and gray, an unfortunately generic sci-fi film equivalent to shovelware. As a result of it underperforming to not only game fans but critics alike, Red Faction was never turned into a full series. After the success of Guerrilla, it seems like an odd choice to bring the gameplay back into the tunnels under Mars for its sequel, Red Faction Armageddon. When you're revisiting the game back to back, it oddly makes Guerrilla feel like a mistake, like they were addressing widespread criticism for the open world when in actuality it was by far its strongest part. In some developer interviews, it's noted that their intention was to take the destruction of Guerrilla and bring that action around the player, providing a more 360 degrees of intentional destruction design. Armageddon sacrifices player freedom for what on the surface looks like a more deliberate experience. Volition wanted more system for the players to interact with, defined objectives, and once again, a more fleshed out narrative. Something like a TV movie would be unnecessary to Guerrilla's goals, but for a game like Armageddon, it wouldn't be completely unheard of. The game wants to make a connection between the titles, but for the most part, it feels rather tenuous, beyond your player character being Darius Mason, the grandson of Alec. When sitting down with it, I expected Armageddon to be a sort of bridge between what the first-person shooters were doing and what Guerrilla was doing, unifying the series while pushing it forward. Because it was the last in the series in over 10 years, I'd hoped that it was some form of game design climax, bringing it all together. Instead, it's an awkward third-person light survival horror, clearly inspired by Dead Space that stands out against the rest of the series and not in a good way. Part of the reason Guerrilla works as well as it does is because Volition had a sort of central gameplay thesis and built the game around that, allowing the player to experiment with the tools provided. But Armageddon doesn't feel that way. While the destruction is implemented in a very similar way as it was in the original two Red Faction titles, being a sort of add-on to the shooting rather than the main focus, it's still very much a sequel to Guerrilla. And as a result, its gameplay feels substantially more clunky when it's being wrangled into something more linear. It's hard to avoid that there's a rush quality about Armageddon. It jumps around to pre-rendered cutscenes frequently and drags the player by the nose through oftentimes boring levels. To be frank, it's clear that Volition was a studio that had outgrown a linear game like this, from not only the success of Guerrilla, but with what they had begun to do with Saints Row. And as a result, a lot of the technical gameplay growth, whether that's enemy variety or better weapons, still feels stagnant or like they're holding back. It's hard to not compare it with the other games in the series, and this one being the most direct sequel feels like it's missing the qualities that makes these games good and memorable. There's no sense of overcoming a technologically superior force in an improvised way, and it kind of just makes for a generic entry in the series. While it's purely my suspicion, this feels at least partially because Volition was spread a little thin. Saints Row the Third and Guillermo del Toro's Insane were announced in 2009 and 2010 respectively, and the latter was still a full year out from being cancelled when Armageddon was released. Saints Row had become the studio's flagship franchise, and the development of two open-world titles in very different settings, released within 5 months, is not only a tricky task for a studio of this size, but also runs the risk of the titles competing with each other. Saints Row being the bigger seller would likely be the one that wouldn't change. Additionally, while it seems minor today, putting Red Faction on Sci-Fi up for what was intended to be a TV series is a big ask for a franchise that had just come out of being dormant. That coupled with the Xbox Live Arcade title Red Faction Battleground, it was clear that THQ had high hopes for the franchise's scope after the surprise success of Red Faction Guerrilla. But at the same time, upon the release of Armageddon, THQ was only a year out from closing down completely. And with the benefit of hindsight, it's hard to not feel like maybe the company was gambling on having a big multimedia franchise to either bank their future success on or look more flexible to potential buyers. Regardless, in 2012, THQ would file for bankruptcy. Over the course of 6 years, their shares plummeted from $30 to 11 cents, and the publisher was forced to sell off its assets. While Nordic, who would later change their name to THQ Nordic, would receive the rights to Red Faction, Koch Media would acquire Volition for $22 million, separating the two. Nordic would mention that their intention was to match the acquired IP with a developer that best fits them. However, the series would remain dormant for several years, while Volition would continue their work developing the Saints Row series into its own brand of over-the-top nonsense until it would falter with the failure of its spin-off Agents of Mayhem. In early 2018, this separation would seem irrelevant as Koch Media would be acquired by the rapidly growing Nordic Games, who would allow Koch to operate independently from its other game development and publishing houses. In 2019, Nvidia would release a list of games compatible with its heightened screenshot mode Ansel, that included a new, unannounced title Red Faction Evolution. This was at the same time that THQ Nordic stated that they had 48 titles in development that were yet to be announced. Being only a month out from E3, it was looking more likely that Evolution would be revealed at the publisher's showcase. This, however, wouldn't come to pass. No other leak would corroborate the existence of Evolution or any other Red Faction title at Nordic. The next year in 2020, Volition would be reunited with the franchise in an IP swap between Koch and THQ Nordic, where a handful of games such as Risen and Painkiller would be traded alongside Red Faction, resulting in the original developer once again being under the same umbrella as its IP. While nothing has been set in stone, it seems unlikely that THQ Nordic, now Embracer Group, would go through the trouble of this IP swap without something in mind for the franchise. Whether or not that's in the hands of Volition, if it's Evolution, or if it's an entirely new entry remains to be seen. With the franchise, however, we see a string of surprise successes and miscalculations as a result. Red Faction is a series whose lesson is that brand recognition alone isn't enough. When moving away from the Descent, Volition took a risk, one that the team felt would be unsuccessful. When they reinvented the game for a new generation in a new format and genre, that success encouraged THQ to gamble on its potential with not only a Wii spin-off title, but also a sci-fi original movie, beating Halo to the live-action punch by over 6 years. The successes always seemed to be a surprise, and always resulted in miscalculations that anything with the Red Faction name would be a success. It's also a series with long gaps and strong reinventions, and while they're not all winners, it makes for something that's unpredictable, which feels refreshing in a time when iterative sequels are so common. In the future, we may or may not get a new Red Faction game, but whatever it may be, good or bad, it will more likely be something interesting, and that's really what counts.